The year 1876 had wrung the Llano Estacado dry. Dust, fine as sifted flour, settled over Eliza Hale's small ranch, coating the stiff, thirsty leaves of the cornstalks and filming the surface of the water in the cattle trough. At 24, Eliza was a widow, a title that felt as ill-fitting and cumbersome as her late husband's winter coat. The land was all she had left of him, this stubborn patch of Texas panhandle that promised everything and gave only what it pleased, which lately was not much. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, and the horizon shimmered with heat that distorted the very air she breathed. Each day was a testament to survival, a catechism of chores recited through action. She rose before the sun, her hands already calloused and knowing as she worked the udders of her 3 milk cows, their familiar warmth a small comfort in the vast, indifferent landscape. She spoke to them in low tones, their names patience, hope, and mercy. A quiet prayer she sent out into the dawn, the cornfield. Her husband Samuel's pride was her greatest worry. Its stalks were stunted, the ears small and tight. She had spent weeks hauling water from the nearly exhausted creek, bucket by weary bucket, a battle against the inevitable that left her shoulders aching and her spirit frayed. Loneliness was a constant companion, a silent presence at her dinner table, a shadow that stretched long beside her as she mended the barbed wire fences that sagged as if in exhaustion. It was in the silence of the cabin after dark, a quiet so profound she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. The threat of rustlers was a low hum of anxiety, a story told in whispers by riders passing through, of herds vanished overnight. And then there was the other fear, the one spoken of with a mix of anger and dread, the Comanche. Tensions had been escalating, fueled by the drought that pushed everyone, settler and native alike, to desperation. The world felt like a tightly wound spring, ready to snap. Miles away, where the scorched plains gave way to the broken country of the Caprock Canyons, Tahan moved with a silence that was part of the land itself. At 23, he carried the weight of a warrior's duty. His eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. He was a scout for his people, the Nemenu, tasked with a mission that tasted of deceit and gunpowder. He was not tracking soldiers or settlers, but the shadow men, the ones who sold repeating rifles and whiskey, poisoning the wells of peace for the glitter of coin. These men, his elders believed, were the source of the renewed conflict, stoking the fires of old hatreds so they could profit from the chaos. His task was to find their trail, to uncover the truth before it was buried under a war his people could not afford to fight. His senses were honed to the language of the prairie, a displaced stone, a bruised stem of grass, the distant, agitated cry of a hawk. Each was a word, a sentence in a story he was piecing together. He had found the tracks of shod horses where they should not be. Near a secluded spring, he had found the lingering scent of cheap cigars in a rocky overhang. The trail was cold, but it was there, a snake slithering through the dry grass, and his honor as a scout demanded he follow it to its head. The land was his sacred trust, and he felt the sickness of the lies being spread across it like a fever in his own blood. He felt the pull of his duty, a cord of discipline and tradition that guided his every step. That night, a sliver of moon offered little light, and the stars seemed cold and impossibly distant. Eliza had just finished her meager supper of cornbread and milk when the smell first reached her. It was acrid, sharp, the scent of burning grass carried on the relentless wind. She stepped outside the cabin, her hands shielding her eyes as she looked toward the southern horizon. A faint, angry orange pulsed against the darkness, a hungry glow that was growing brighter by the second. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. The pasture, the cattle. Her entire world was made of dry tinder, a single spark away from ruin. She did not hesitate. Grabbing the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs by the door, she ran toward the corral, her boots kicking up puffs of dust. The cows were already restless, lowing in distress. their eyes wide in the growing, hellish light. She had to get them to the fallow field on the north side of the creek, a natural firebreak that might just save them. As she fumbled with the corral gate, her hands trembling, she saw him, a rider, a silhouette against the wall of advancing flame, sitting perfectly still on his horse at the edge of her property. A thief, an arsonist. Every fearful story she had ever heard coalesced into the dark shape of that man. Rage, hot and protective, surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. She raised the rifle, the stock firm against her shoulder. Tahan had been circling back toward the canyons when the fire blossomed in the darkness. He turned his pinto toward it instantly, his every instinct on alert. A prairie fire in a drought this severe was a weapon. He urged his horse to a gallop, not to flee, but to understand. As he neared the small, isolated ranch, he saw the lone figure of a woman, a rifle in her hands. He reined in his horse, his own hand resting lightly on the stock of his carbine. He had found a set of fresh tracks just an hour earlier. Near this very fence line, the tracks of a heavy man in hobnailed boots. The fire's origin seemed suspiciously close to where those tracks had been. This woman, alone and armed, in the heart of the blaze, raised 100 questions. Was she a victim or something else? "Get off my land!" Eliza's voice was tight, strained, but carried clearly over the crackle of the approaching flames. Tahan did not move. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the small cabin, the meager cornfield, the panicked livestock. This was not the holding of a wealthy rancher involved in illegal trade. This was the work of a survivor. Still, he had to be certain. He remained silent, watching her, his stillness a question in itself. "Did you hear me?" she shouted, taking a half-step forward. "I see you. You light this fire. You think you can steal my stock in the confusion." The accusation hung in the smoky air between them. He finally spoke, his voice calm and low, a stark contrast to the growing roar of the fire. "The fire is not my work." He gestured with his chin to the south, where the flames were thickest. It started there, near the fence, where a white man left his boot prints an hour ago. Eliza faltered, the rifle wavering for a fraction of a second. Boot prints. She had not been to the south fence all day. A cold dread began to creep up her spine, a feeling more terrifying than the sight of a single rider. But she could not afford to trust him. He was Comanche, in her world. That was reason enough for suspicion. "Lies," she spat, the word tasting like ash. "You're all alike, trying to drive us out." A shower of embers, carried on a sudden gust of wind, rained down between them, igniting small, fleeting blossoms of fire in the parched grass. The main blaze was closer now, a monstrous, living thing that breathed heat and devoured everything in its path. The cattle, their terror breaking free of the corral, burst through the wooden gate, scattering in a blind panic. In that moment, the confrontation between them became insignificant, a foolish squabble in the face of a god's wrath. The land itself was the enemy, and it was coming for them both. Eliza's internal conflict, the fear of losing her last foothold in the world, gave way to the primal instinct to save what was hers. For Tahan, the mission to find the truth was momentarily superseded by the immediate reality of the fire. He saw the woman lower her rifle and run after the terrified animals, her form small and desperate against the inferno. He saw the futility of her solo effort, his own burgeoning feelings, a flicker of something akin to pity or respect for her grit, warred with his ingrained caution. He nudged his pinto forward, not with a word, but with a simple, decisive action. He began to ride, not at her, but in a wide, sweeping arc, his movements fluid and expert. He got ahead of the stampeding cows, turning them, his horse responding to the slightest pressure of his knees. He was not stealing them. He was herding them, pushing them away from the fire, toward the dark, safe shape of the creek bed. Eliza watched for a heartbeat, stunned. Then, understanding dawned. This was not an attack. This was help. She did not have time to question it. She ran to the other side of the small herd, waving her arms, her voice raw as she yelled, guiding the frightened animals. They worked in a strange, unspoken partnership. Two enemies united against a common foe. The air was thick with smoke that burned their lungs and made their eyes stream. The heat was a physical blow, baking their skin. The roar of the fire was a deafening, all-consuming sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Together, they pushed the last of the cows down the embankment and into the shallow, muddy water of the creek. They stood on the opposite bank, chests heaving, watching as the wall of fire reached the edge of the creek and, denied its fuel, began to falter, its rage slowly diminishing. It would burn itself out along the water's edge, leaving a black, smoking scar upon the land. But the cabin, the barn, and the cattle were safe. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the dying fire and their own ragged breaths. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind an eerie, smoke-filled quiet. The stars, which had been obscured by the glow, began to reappear in the darkened sky. Tahan dismounted, his movements economical and weary. He walked back across the creek, his moccasins silent on the damp earth, and stopped a respectful distance from her. He looked toward the south fence line, now a series of smoldering posts. "The tracks are gone now," he said, his voice still low and even. "Burned over, but they were there. A heavy man. The heels of his boots were worn on the outside." Eliza followed his gaze, her knuckles white where she still gripped the rifle. She knew he was telling the truth. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold stone. Someone else had been on her land. Someone had set this fire deliberately. The rider she had been ready to shoot was not the source of her terror, but perhaps the only witness to it. She looked at him then, truly saw him for the first time, not as a faceless threat, but as a man. His face was streaked with soot, his expression unreadable but for a deep weariness in his eyes that mirrored her own. The deep chasm of prejudice and fear between them had not vanished, but a fragile bridge of shared experience had been thrown across it, forged in smoke and desperation. The enemy was not the man standing before her. The enemy was a phantom in heavy boots, a ghost who left nothing behind but destruction and the question that now hung palpably in the cold night air, who was trying to burn them all off this merciless, unyielding land. The dawn that followed the fire was a study in gray. A pall of smoke still hung in the air, thick and acrid, clinging to the back of the throat. Eliza stood on her porch, a tin cup of weak coffee held in hands that still trembled slightly. Before her, a wide black crescent was gouged into the landscape, a wound on the earth that steamed in the pale morning light. The smell of burnt grass was the smell of loss, of how quickly everything could be taken away. He was still there, across the creek with the cattle, the Comanche scout, Tahan. He had not approached her cabin, but had kept a silent, watchful vigil over her small herd, his pinto grazing peacefully nearby as if the night's chaos had been nothing more than a bad dream. She felt a knot of confusion and lingering suspicion tighten in her gut. Everything she had been taught, every whispered warning from her neighbors, told her to fear him. Yet, he had saved her livelihood. He had faced the flames with her. When the sun was fully risen, she walked to the creek, her steps heavy. He met her at the water's edge, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been in the firelight. "They are unharmed," he said, his gaze on the cows, "only frightened." "Thank you," Eliza said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "I would have lost them." He gave a slight nod, accepting her gratitude without ceremony. An awkward silence fell between them, filled by the lowing of the cattle. She knew she should tell him to leave, that his presence on her land was a complication she could not afford. But the memory of those other boot prints, the ones consumed by the fire, held her tongue. She spent the morning inspecting the animals, running her hands over their hides, checking for burns and calming their frayed nerves. It was on Mercy, the gentlest of her cows, that she found it, high on the animal's flank. Partially hidden by the coarse hair was a freshly made mark. It was not her brand, the simple Eoin for hail. This was a crude shape, seared into the skin, a triangle with one side missing. It was still raw, a mark of violation. A surge of cold fury went through her. Someone had been close enough to put their hands on her animals, to claim them with this ugly symbol. She looked up, her eyes finding Tahan, who was watching her with an unnerving stillness. She beckoned him over, her voice sharp with anger. "Look at this." He came and knelt, his long fingers gently parting the hair around the brand. He traced its outline in the air without touching the tender skin. When he looked up at her, his dark eyes were grim. "The flawed triangle," he said, his voice low. "It is the mark of Madden and Pike." The names meant nothing to Eliza. "Who are they?" "They are men who trade in misery," Tahan explained, rising to his full height. "They sell whiskey to warriors who have lost their way and rifles to any man with a grievance. They profit when blood is shed, red or white." He looked from the brand to the burned field and back to her. "They want this land to burn. A war between the settlers and the Nemenu would make them rich." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more terrifying than a simple cattle thief. The fire, the phantom boot prints, this ugly mark. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to push an already tense situation over the edge. They wanted it to look like a raid, she whispered, the horror of it dawning on her. "They brand my cow, set a fire. Everyone would blame." She trailed off, looking at him. Everyone would blame his people. "My first thought must be the fort," she said, her resolve hardening. "I'll ride to Fort Elliott. I will tell Captain Biddle what happened. The army can track these men down." Tahan's expression did not change, but a deep skepticism settled in his eyes. "The men in blue uniforms," he asked, "they hear what they want to hear. They see what they want to see. And for many of them, a dead Comanche is a good thing, no matter whose bullet finds him. They will listen to your story, and then they will write in their report that it was a raid, because that is the easier story to tell." His words were a cold splash of water, extinguishing her flicker of hope. He was right, or he could be. She had heard stories of the soldiers' indifference, of their outright hostility. Who would they believe, a lone widow with a wild story, or the convenient narrative of an Indian raid? "So we do nothing?" she demanded, frustration rising in her voice. "We let them get away with this." "I did not say that," he replied. "I am hunting them. It is my duty, but I do it the way of my people. I follow the sign they leave, not the laws they write on paper. Your fort is a place of walls and bugles. The truth I seek is written on the land." They stood at an impasse, two worlds colliding. Her world believed in laws, in soldiers, in a system that was supposed to provide justice. His world believed in honor, in reading the earth, in a justice that was meted out by those who had been wronged. Eliza looked at her parched cornfield, at the black scar on her pasture, at the ugly brand on her cow. Her system had failed to protect her. Tahan's words, born of a bitter experience she could only imagine, rang with a hard truth. A thought came to her then, born of pure necessity. "The creek is almost dry," she said, changing the subject. "But it still has water. It is deep. My husband dug it the year before he passed." She remembered Samuel's pride in that well, the way he had struck a deep, cold aquifer that had never failed them. "It is the only sure water for miles." Tahan's gaze shifted to her small hand pump, a lonely sentinel of iron near the cabin. He understood. Water was life. In this drought, it was more precious than gold. "I will make you a bargain," Eliza said, her voice finding a new strength. "You need information to find these men, Madden and Pike. I need to protect my home. I will give you water, for you and your horse. In exchange, you tell me what you find. You help me watch this land. We work together, for a time, each with our own honor. No soldiers, no laws, just your word, and mine. It was a reckless offer, an alliance with a man she was supposed to call her enemy. But the fire had burned away her old certainties, leaving behind the stark reality of survival. He studied her for a long time, his eyes searching her face. He was weighing her, testing the substance of her words. He thought of his grandmother, Neka, and the stories she told by the winter fire. She had always said that honor was not a thing of skin color, but of the heart. It could be found in surprising places. She would say, like a spring flower pushing through hard rock. He remembered the day of his warrior's trial, when he had gone into the hills alone, with only a knife and the clothes on his back. He had learned then that survival depended on seeing the world as it was, not as others told you it was. This woman, with her calloused hands and tired, defiant eyes, was part of the world as it was. "You're well for my eyes," he said at last. "That is a fair trade. I give you my word. I will be a shadow to this place. I will learn what these men are planning." A fragile truce settled between them. Later that day, as he drew water from her well, the squeak of the pump handle a rhythmic, reassuring sound. Eliza found herself lost in memory. She saw her father, a big, gentle man with dirt under his fingernails, standing in this very field. He was showing her how to plant corn, placing a single kernel into her small hand. "You have to listen to the land, Eliza," he had told her, his voice a low rumble. "It will tell you what it needs. You just have to be patient enough to hear it." He had taught her resilience, taught her that true strength was not in shouting, but in enduring, like a cornstalk in the ceaseless Texas wind. Her mother had been the quiet heart of their home, a woman who faded like a photograph left in the sun, taken by a fever when Eliza was just a girl. It was from her mother's absence that Eliza had learned the hard lesson of self-reliance. As Tahan let his pinto drink its fill from the bucket, he too was drawn into the past. He saw his grandmother's face, her skin a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of generations. "A man's honor is his spirit's horse," she had told him, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "If it is strong, it will carry you across any canyon. If it is weak, it will stumble on the smallest stone." She had taught him to see beyond the surface, to understand that the white men were not one people, but many. Some were greedy, like the wolf. Some were foolish, like the prairie dog. And some, a very few, were like the badger, fierce and solitary, but honorable in their own territory. He wondered which kind this woman was. That evening, Tahan returned as silently as he had left. He did not approach the cabin, but waited until she came out for her evening chores. "I cut their trail again," he said, materializing from the twilight shadows. 3 riders. They circled wide to the north, toward the Red Rock Canyons. "They think no one is watching." He paused, then added a detail that made Eliza's blood run cold. "I have seen one of them before, near the fort. He was sharing a bottle with one of the guards from the east gate. They were laughing like old friends." There it was, the twist of the knife. A soldier, a guard at the fort she had been so ready to run to. The foundation of her world cracked a little more. Tahan's skepticism had been rooted in something real. The lawmen and the lawless were drinking from the same bottle. The brand on her cow was more than just a mark of ownership. It was a symbol of a creeping corruption, a sign that the boundaries she thought were clear between right and wrong, law and crime, friend and enemy were blurring and dissolving like a trail in a dust storm. She was truly on her own. Except she was not. She looked at the Comanche scout, his silhouette dark against the fading light, and understood that their desperate, unlikely pact was the only law that mattered now. The days that followed settled into a tense, watchful rhythm. The sun continued its relentless assault, and the water level in Eliza's well dropped a fraction of an inch each day, a slow, terrifying measurement of their dwindling time. Tahan came and went like a ghost, appearing at dawn or dusk with scraps of information. He confirmed the presence of 3 riders, their trail leading toward the rough, broken country of the canyons. They moved with purpose, he said, like men who knew exactly where they were going and why. He watered his pinto, accepted a slab of cornbread from Eliza, and would vanish again into the vast, shimmering emptiness of the plains. Their interactions were brief, practical, conducted across a chasm of unspoken words, yet a strange sort of familiarity was growing between them. Eliza found herself listening for the soft thud of his horse's hooves, and the silence felt heavier when he was gone. He, in turn, began to see the ranch not just as a watering hole, but as a small, stubborn island of defiance in a sea of hostility. Its queen, a woman with tired eyes and a spine made of steel. It was the 5th day after the fire when the well pump began to draw air. It came up with a sickening gasp, spitting a mouthful of muddy water before giving up completely. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Eliza. Without the well, she had nothing. The cattle could not survive, the corn was already lost, and she would be forced to abandon the last piece of her life with Samuel. Her father's words came back to her. A faint echo from a greener time listened to the land. She remembered a story the old-timers told, of a series of seeps and springs that traced a line through the low canyons a few miles to the west, a hidden vein of life that sometimes survived even the worst droughts. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one she had. She left a full bucket of water for Tahan by the silent pump, a gesture of faith she hoped he would understand. Taking a canteen and her rifle, she set out on foot, following the dry, meandering scar of the creek bed. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the moisture from her breath. The world was bleached of color, all shades of brown and beige under a pitiless white sky. After 2 hours of walking, the landscape began to change. The flat prairie gave way to gentle, rolling hills, then to the edges of shallow canyons, their sides dotted with hardy juniper and fragrant sagebrush. And then she heard it, a sound so faint she thought she was imagining it, the quiet, musical trickle of water over stone. She pushed through a thicket of willows, their leaves brittle and coated with dust, and stopped. There, at the bottom of a small, sheltered arroyo, was a pool of water, clear and cool, no bigger than her cabin's main room. It was fed by a slow, steady drip from a fissure in the red rock wall, a miraculous offering from the parched earth. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. She knelt at the water's edge, splashed her face, and drank deeply from her cupped hands. The water was clean and cold, tasting of stone and deep earth. The place was utterly secluded, a hidden sanctuary walled in by rock and willow and silence. The oppressive weight of the sun was gentled here, the air cooler. The grime and sweat and fear of the past week felt like a heavy, suffocating coat, without a second thought, driven by a deep, instinctual need for cleansing. She shed her dusty dress and chemise and slipped into the cool embrace of the water. The relief was absolute. The water soothed her sunburnt skin, washed the dust from her hair, and seemed to dissolve the knot of tension in her shoulders. She floated on her back for a moment, looking up at the small patch of blue sky visible through the canyon walls. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sliver of peace, a quiet moment of being that was not defined by work or worry or fear. Tahan had been following the rider's trail when it had unexpectedly doubled back, leading him in a wide, confusing circle. He was cutting across country, trying to pick up the scent again, when his pinto's ears swiveled, catching a sound he had missed: water. He dismounted, moving with the innate stealth of a hunter, drawn by the promise of a resource more valuable than any currency. He approached the arroyo from the high ground, parting the branches of a juniper to look down, and he saw her. The world seemed to stop. He saw the pale gleam of her skin in the dappled light, her dark hair fanned out in the clear water. The moment was intensely private, an accidental intrusion into a sacred space. His first instinct, immediate and powerful, was to pull back, to erase his presence. He turned away at once, his back to the scene, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. A deep sense of honor, ingrained in him since childhood, warred with the stark reality of the image seared into his mind. He had seen her not as a settler, not as a piece in the puzzle he was trying to solve, but simply as a woman, vulnerable and beautiful in her solitude. He stood there, hidden, his back to the pool, a silent guardian she did not know she had. He knew that if he simply retreated, she might never know he had been there. But he also knew that if she were to emerge and find him, or his tracks, her sense of safety in this place would be shattered. Fear would replace peace. Trust, the fragile, unacknowledged thing growing between them, would be poisoned. He had to give her the dignity of knowing she was no longer alone, but he had to do it in a way that did not frighten her. He picked up a small, loose stone. After a moment's hesitation, he tossed it so it landed with a soft clatter on the rock face a dozen yards down the arroyo. The sound was small, but sharp enough to cut through the gentle murmur of the spring. In the pool, Eliza froze. The sound was unmistakable. She was not alone. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. She sank lower in the water, her eyes scanning the rim of the canyon. She reached for the bank, for the rifle she had left propped against a rock. "Do not be afraid," a low voice said. Tahan's voice. It came from behind a screen of willows, and he did not show himself. "I did not mean to intrude. I will wait down creek until you are ready." The fear receded, replaced by a complex wave of emotion. He had seen her. The thought sent a flush of heat through her that had nothing to do with the sun, but he had not stared. He had turned away. He had announced himself, giving her warning, giving her control. It was an act of profound and unexpected decency. In a world where men often took what they wanted without asking, this quiet, deliberate act of respect was more disarming than any threat. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons on her dress. When she was ready, her rifle held loosely in her hand, she called out, her voice steadier than she expected. "You can come out." He appeared from the willows, his gaze fixed on the ground at her feet. He did not look at her face. He held up his own nearly empty canteen. "I was tracking, and my search led me to water." A Comanche scout found her bathing in the creek, and his thirst for truth could not be quenched by water alone. The thought moved through Tahan's mind with the clarity of the spring itself. This moment, this unexpected intersection of their lives, was about more than a shared resource. It was about seeing the person behind the label, the humanity beneath the hardship. The truth he sought was not just about guns and greed, but about whether two people from different worlds could find a patch of common ground. "There is enough for both of us," she said quietly. He filled his canteen, then moved to sit on a wide, flat boulder in the shade, leaving ample space between them. The silence that fell was different from their earlier ones. It was less awkward, more contemplative. Eliza hesitated for a moment, then sat on the other end of the rock. She took a small bundle wrapped in cloth from her pocket. It was the cornbread she had packed that morning. She broke it in half and held a piece out to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting instant. The touch was light, accidental, but it sent a strange current through the air. They ate in silence, the simple food a communion. "I am afraid," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I am afraid of losing this place. It is all I have." He chewed his cornbread slowly, considering her words. "Fear is a wise guide," he finally said. "It tells us what is worth fighting for. My people are afraid, too. We are afraid of being forgotten. We are afraid of our stories turning to dust, like the bones of the buffalo." He looked out at the canyon, but she knew he was seeing something far beyond it. These men, Madden and Pike, they sell fear. They want us to be so afraid of each other that we forget to be afraid of them. They sat there for a long time, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and rose. The distance between them on the hard, steadfast rock seemed to shrink, not in a physical sense, but in an emotional one. They were two people, from two worlds, sharing their fears under an endless Texas sky. As the shadows lengthened, Eliza knew she had to head back. She stood up, brushing the crumbs from her dress. Her eyes drifted to the base of the willows near the pool's edge, where the roots twisted out of the damp earth like gnarled fingers. A small glint of brass caught her eye, something out of place in the natural tapestry of root and mud. Curious, she knelt down. Wedged tightly in the root system was a small metal cylinder, green with verdigris. She worked it free with her fingers. It was a spent cartridge shell, the kind used in a repeating rifle. Someone had been here, in this hidden sanctuary. They had fired a gun, a test shot into the water or the soft earth, where the sound would be muffled by the canyon walls. She held it up for Tahan to see. His face hardened, the brief moment of peace shattered. He took the casing from her, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "They were here," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is their secret place, their meeting spot." The secluded spring was not a sanctuary after all. It was a hideout. The twist of fear was back in Eliza's gut. But this time it was different. It was colder, sharper, laced with a new and determined anger. The water had cleansed the dust from her skin, but this discovery, this small piece of brass, had cleansed the last of her hesitation. The fight was no longer just for her land. It was for this hidden spring, for the truth, and for the man sitting beside her on the stone, whose honor had just built a bridge she was now willing to cross. The small piece of brass felt heavy in Eliza's hand, a cold weight of certainty. The peace of the hidden spring was gone, replaced by the grim reality of what it had been used for. Tahan needed no explanation. He took the cartridge, examined the maker's mark on its base, and then his eyes began to move, scanning the ground not for water, but for the almost invisible signs of men's passage. He pointed to a patch of gravel near the willows. "Here," he said, his voice low and tight. A horse was tied. It was restless. "See how the stones are scuffed in a circle?" Eliza looked, and once he had pointed it out, she could see the subtle disturbance in the earth. He moved from that spot with a focused intensity, his body low to the ground. A bent twig on a sagebrush, a dislodged pebble at the top of the arroyo. To her, it was just a landscape. To him, it was a story, written in a language she was only just beginning to comprehend. The trail was faint, but Tahan followed it as if it were a paved road, leading them away from the life-giving spring and deeper into the desolate, broken country. They walked for another hour under the oppressive sun, the sky around them taking on a hazy, yellowish tinge. The wind began to pick up, not a cooling breeze, but a hot, dry breath that carried the taste of grit and distance. It whispered through the rocks and whipped at Eliza's dress, a mournful, unsettling sound. The trail led them to a place that felt forsaken by God and man alike. It was the remains of a small homestead, a sad collection of buildings sagging into the dust. The cabin's roof had caved in, its windows like vacant eyes. The corral fence was a broken-toothed grin of rotting wood. A profound silence hung over the place, the kind of quiet that follows a tragedy. Tahan held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He moved forward alone, his steps making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He circled the main cabin, then the small, dilapidated barn, his eyes missing nothing. After a long moment, he waved her forward. "They were here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of the place, and not long ago. The air inside the barn was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and decay. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. In one corner, stacked against a crumbling wall, were several wooden crates. The stenciling on their sides had been crudely scraped away, but the dark stains that had seeped into the wood told their own story. Tahan pried one open with the tip of his knife. It was empty, but the cloying, sour smell of cheap whiskey billowed out. In another corner was a pile of what looked like metal scrap. Eliza knelt closer and saw they were rifle parts, cracked stocks, bent barrels, broken firing mechanisms, the refuse of the gun trade. "They use this place as a way station," Tahan said, his gaze sweeping the shadowy interior. "They bring the whiskey and the guns here, then move them in smaller amounts to avoid suspicion. These are the ones that are broken, not worth selling." It was all here, the proof of their conspiracy. This was the heart of the poison that was seeping into the land. As Eliza stood, her boot scuffed something in the thick layer of dust and grime on the floor. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, silver concho, the kind used to decorate a hatband. It was tarnished and dull, but an ornate letter P was clearly engraved in its center. "Pike," she breathed, holding it out to him. The silver felt cold in her palm. It was a mistake, a piece of vanity carelessly dropped and left behind. It was their first solid piece of evidence, a direct link to one of the men. A small, triumphant smile touched Eliza's lips, but it vanished as Tahan suddenly stiffened, his head cocked, listening. "Riders," he said, his voice a sharp command. "Coming fast." They hurried to the barn's wide, slatted door and peered through a crack. 4 men on horseback were approaching the homestead at a gallop, their figures distorted by the shimmering heat and the increasingly hazy air. They were not Madden's men. They were a harder-looking sort, their faces grim, their rifles held ready in saddle scabbards. Bounty hunters. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do we do?" "They have not seen us," Tahan said calmly, though his eyes were flinty and alert. "Stay here. Be silent." But it was too late. One of the riders pointed toward the barn, Tahan's pinto, which he had left tied in a small gully behind the homestead. Must have been spotted. The men fanned out, their rifles now in their hands, and surrounded the barn. "Come on out," a loud voice boomed, belonging to a big, bearded man who seemed to be the leader. "We know you are in there. We got you cornered. Boy." Tahan looked at Eliza. There was no escape. He gave a single, sharp nod, a silent instruction for her to stay put, and then he stepped out into the yellow glare of the afternoon, his hands held open and away from his body to show he was unarmed. "I am here," Tahan said, his voice even. The leader smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips. "Well, look what we have here, Tahan of the Nemina. There's a tidy price on your head. Some folks over at the Hale place say you burned their pasture and tried to run off with their cattle." Ice flowed through Eliza's veins. A lie, a deliberate, vicious lie had been spread to turn Tahan from a scout into a fugitive. She stepped out of the barn then, her own rifle held loosely at her side. "That is not true," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense air. The 4 men turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Ma'am, this is not your concern," the leader said, his tone dismissive. "This is official business." "This man is in my employ," Eliza said, the words coming to her in a flash of desperate inspiration. She took a step forward, placing herself slightly in front of Tahan. "He was with me last night, helping me save my herd from a fire set by an arsonist." The bounty hunter laughed. "A short, ugly bark. In your employ, a likely story. Now step aside before you get hurt." "I have the deed to my land," Eliza said, her chin rising. The wind was whipping her hair across her face, and she had to raise her voice to be heard over its rising howl. "It is filed and recorded at the courthouse in Mobiti. This man was on my property, with my permission, as a hired hand. You have no jurisdiction over him there, and you have no warrant for his arrest that I have seen." She was bluffing, gambling with words against armed men. She was using their own laws, their own system, against them, turning their paperwork and procedures into a shield. The leader's smirk faltered. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. He looked at his companions, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "We do not need a warrant for a thieving redskin," one of the other men growled. "This is Texas," Eliza shot back, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not feel. "And you do need a warrant, unless you witnessed a crime yourself. Did any of you see him steal my cattle? Because I will stand before the circuit judge and swear on a Bible that he did not." The standoff was stretched thin, a wire about to snap. The sky had grown dark, the color of a deep bruise. The wind was no longer whispering. It was screaming. A high, thin shriek that tore at the dilapidated buildings and flung stinging sheets of sand and dust into the air. The horses became spooked, their eyes rolling as they fought against the rains. It was the opening Tahan had been waiting for. The world dissolved into a blinding, roaring chaos of yellow dust. Visibility dropped to near zero. He grabbed Eliza's arm. "Now." He pulled her toward the gully where his horse was tethered. The bounty hunters were momentarily blinded, shouting curses as they tried to control their panicking mounts. In the whirlwind, Tahan moved with a swift, sure-footed grace. He untied his pinto, swung into the saddle, and pulled Eliza up behind him in one fluid motion. "Hold on," he shouted over the storm's fury. The pinto, sure-footed and calm even in the gale, scrambled up the side of the gully and broke into a dead run, its hooves pounding the earth. They were a fleeting shadow in the maelstrom, swallowed by the dust. Behind them, they could hear enraged shouts, but they were quickly lost to the roar of the wind. They rode blindly, Tahan trusting his horse and his own sense of direction to carry them through the storm. The sand scoured their skin and filled their lungs. It was like being caught in a monstrous, malevolent wave that had risen from the land itself, after what felt like an eternity. Tahan guided the pinto into the lee of a rocky outcrop, a small pocket of relative calm amidst the tempest. They slid from the horse's back, coughing, their eyes streaming, their bodies aching. As they huddled against the rock, another figure stumbled out of the swirling dust. It was one of the bounty hunters, a younger man, his face pale with fear. He had lost his horse and his companions in the chaos. He saw them and froze, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. Tahan simply stood, watching him, making no move. Eliza held her breath. The young man's bravado crumbled. "I do not want any trouble," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I am just a hired man. I did not know." "You knew you were hunting an innocent man," Eliza said, her voice raw. "It was just a job," he protested. "Madden paid us. He pays well." The name hung in the air, heavy and damning. "Look," the man said, his fear making him reckless. "You best be careful. It is not just you he is after. Madden has a list of all the small ranchers with creek access or a good well. He aims to burn or scare every last one of you out so he can buy up the water rights for nothing." He stared at them for another moment, then turned and plunged back into the howling dust storm, a lost soul in the heart of the tempest. Eliza and Tahan looked at each other. The wind shrieked around them, but in their small shelter, a new, terrible quiet had fallen. The silver concho in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. It was no longer just about a fire, or a few stolen cattle, or even the threat to her own small ranch. It was a war, a quiet, systematic war for the water, for the very lifeblood of the Llano Estacado. And Madden had a list of his next victims. The dust storm raged for what felt like an eternity, a blind, suffocating force that scoured the world clean. When it finally passed, it left behind a landscape transformed. The air was strangely clear, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The sun beat down on an earth that seemed to have been stripped to its bones, every contour sharpened, every stone laid bare. They had survived, huddled in the shallow embrace of the rock. But the world felt new and menacing. The bounty hunter was gone, swallowed by the storm, his warning a lingering poison in the air. "We cannot go back to your ranch," Tahan said, his voice raspy with dust. "They will be watching for us now. Madden will have men everywhere." Eliza knew he was right. Her small cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a trap. The silver concho in her pocket, proof of Pike's presence, felt useless if she could not get it to someone who would listen. And after the bounty hunter's revelation, She no longer knew who that might be. She looked at Tahan, his face a grim mask of dust and determination. In the space of a few days, he had become the only person in this vast, hostile land she could trust. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice small against the immense silence left by the storm. He did not answer immediately. He looked to the west, toward the jagged line of the Caprock Canyons, a place of shadows and secrets. The decision he was about to make was a heavy one, a crossing of a line that was rarely, if ever, crossed. To take her to his people was to expose them to a danger from her world, but to leave her was to abandon her to that same danger, alone. He thought of his grandmother's words about honor being found in surprising places. He had given this woman his word. That was a rope that could not be easily cut. "There is a place," he said at last, "a safe place, but you must come as a guest, with an open heart and a quiet tongue. You must see with your own eyes, and listen with your own ears." Their journey was a silent one. Tahan led them on a circuitous route, through hidden arroyos and along game trails that were invisible to Eliza's untrained eye. He was taking them into the heart of his world, a world she had only known through fearful stories and whispered prejudice. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows, they entered a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, the red rock glowing like embers in the last light. The path twisted and turned, a natural labyrinth designed to discourage pursuit. And then, the canyon opened into a wide, hidden bowl, a natural fortress of stone. A dozen hide lodges, or teepees, were scattered among a grove of cottonwood trees that grew along a small, clear running creek. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of pure, uncomplicated life. This was his home, a place of community and survival, hidden away from the world that sought to crush it. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. People stopped what they were doing, their faces turning toward the newcomers. The laughter of the children died away. The gazes that fell upon Eliza were not hostile, but they were deeply wary, filled with a caution born of 100 broken promises. She felt a profound sense of being an outsider, a trespasser. She clutched the rifle in her hands, not as a weapon, but as a nervous habit, and was immediately conscious of how threatening it must look. She lowered it, letting it hang loosely at her side. Tahan swung down from his pinto and spoke to a group of men in his own language, his voice low and calm. His words seemed to carry weight. The men looked from him to Eliza and back again, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one of them gave a slow nod. Tahan turned back to her. "Come," he said. "My grandmother wishes to see you." He led her to a teepee that stood slightly apart from the others. It was larger, its hide covering decorated with faded symbols of the sun and the moon. An old woman sat on a buffalo robe by a small, central fire, her hands busy weaving a basket from willow shoots. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of a long life, her skin the color of rich earth, her eyes, dark and bright, seemed to look right through Eliza, seeing not just the dusty, tired woman who stood before her, but the entire history that had brought her to this place. This was Neka, the keeper of the memory of her people. Tahan spoke to her respectfully, his tone a mixture of love and reverence. Eliza could not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. He was explaining who she was and why she was there. Neka listened without interrupting, her nimble fingers never ceasing their work. When he was finished, she looked at Eliza, and for the first time, she spoke in English, her voice a low, musical rasp, like stones tumbling in a stream. "You carry the smell of the storm on you. Child," she said, "and a great trouble. Sit." Eliza hesitated, feeling clumsy and out of place. She remembered Tahan's words with an open heart and a quiet tongue. From the small satchel she carried, she took out the gifts she had brought on her fool's errand to find water, a small, precious bag of salt, and a bolt of blue calico cloth she had been saving. These were things of her world, but they were also things of value, of trade. She approached the old woman and laid them gently on the robe beside her. A humble offering. It was a gesture of asking, not demanding, permission to be present. Neka looked at the gifts, then back at Eliza. A flicker of something, perhaps approval, warmed her ancient eyes. "Salt is a promise," she said softly, "and cloth is a comfort. You have a respectful heart, even if it is a frightened one. Sit." Eliza sat on a robe opposite the old woman, the small fire crackling between them. Tahan sat beside his grandmother, a silent, watchful presence. For a long time, no one spoke. Neka's hands moved, weaving the story of the willow into a beautiful, sturdy shape. Outside, the camp settled into the rhythms of the evening. The firelight danced on their faces, throwing their shadows against the hide walls of the teepee. "This land you call Texas," Neka began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It has a long memory. It remembers the time before the fences, before the iron horse. It remembers when this creek we sit beside ran so full of fish you could catch them with your hands. It was called the Creek of the Chattering Birds then." She paused, a sad, faraway look in her eyes. "The birds are mostly gone now. Their chatter is a song our children will never hear." She told them stories of the treaties, of the men who came with their papers and their sweet words, promising peace and shared land. She spoke of the lines drawn on maps, lines that cut through ancient hunting grounds and separated families. Each promise, she said, was a thread, and each broken promise was a thread cut, until the whole weaving of trust had unraveled, leaving them with nothing but the cold wind. "The white man's thirst is a strange thing," she said, her gaze finding Eliza's in the flickering light. "It is not for water alone. It is a thirst for ownership. They wish to own the land, the sky, the water. They do not understand that it is the land that owns us. It feeds us, shelters us, and when our time is done, it takes us back into its arms. This Madden, this Pike, they suffer from this great thirst. They think if they can own all the water, they will be powerful. They are like a man who tries to catch the wind in a jar. All he is left with is empty hands." As she spoke, she began to hum, a low, haunting melody. It was a tune that held the sadness of generations, the memory of loss, the unyielding strength of survival. It was a lullaby, Eliza realized, a song of the collective heart of a people, in that small, fire-lit space. Listening to that ancient song, Eliza felt the boundaries of her own small world dissolve. Her fight for her farm, her fear for her own life, was just one small story in this much larger, older tragedy. Her personal survival was now inextricably linked to the survival of these people, to the idea of a justice that went far beyond deeds and property lines. She was no longer just defending her land. She was defending a shared right to exist. The flap of the teepee was pushed aside, and a young warrior entered, his face grim. He spoke rapidly to Tahan, his words sharp and urgent. Tahan's body went rigid, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He turned to his grandmother, and then to Eliza. "A rider from the north," he translated, his voice heavy. "Madden has spread a new story. He claims a Comanche war party, led by me, is preparing to attack the fort. He is paying men to fire on the patrols, to make it look real. He wants the soldiers to come. He wants them to ride in here, to declare us hostile, so the government will have an excuse to force us onto the reservation lands in the territory." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. It was a checkmate, a manufactured war, a land grab sanctioned by the law. They would be swept away, their history and their lives erased from this land, all for Madden's profit. A fire ignited in Eliza's chest, a righteous anger that burned hotter than any prairie fire. She looked from Tahan's enraged face to Neka's sad, wise eyes. She would not let this happen. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a new, unshakable resolve. "We have to show the soldiers the truth before it is too late." "Madden's place, his mercantile post, is 2 days' ride from here," Tahan said, the frustration evident in his voice. "His men watch all the main trails. We could never get close without being seen." Neka, who had been listening in silence, set aside her finished basket. Her dark eyes gleamed in the firelight, holding a spark of ancient, cunning knowledge. "There are more trails on this earth than the ones men make with their wagons," she said, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "The white man follows the flat ground. He is afraid of the high places and the deep canyons. But the water knows the way. It always finds a path." She looked directly at Tahan, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is an old smuggler's route, a dry wash that runs behind the high ridge. It will take you to the back of his trading post, where the coyotes and the shadows sleep. It is a hard path, but it is a secret one." Neka's secret path was not a trail for men on horseback, but a scar on the land, a dry wash that snaked its way through a maze of stone and thorns. They traveled by night, the stars their only guide. Tahan leading his pinto with Eliza walking close behind. The journey was arduous, a silent, grinding passage through a landscape that seemed determined to repel them. Rocks tore at their boots, and thorny bushes clawed at their clothes. It was a path of hardship, but it was also a path of trust. With every difficult step, Eliza felt the last vestiges of her old world falling away, replaced by a singular, sharp focus on the man who moved ahead of her with such quiet confidence. He was a part of this harsh land, and for now, so was she. They rested during the heat of the day in a shallow cave that smelled of dust and wild things. Sharing water and the last of their dried meat, they spoke little, their purpose a heavy, unspoken thing that filled the silence. They were no longer a rancher and a scout. They were two people with a single, dangerous objective. As the second dusk began to fall, Tahan pointed to a faint, dirty smudge on the horizon. "The town," he said. "We will be there before dawn." The plan they devised was simple. Born of desperation and their limited resources, deception was their only weapon. Eliza would be their way in. She would borrow Tahan's pinto and approach the town from the main road, as if she were a homesteader's wife coming to sell a small amount of milk and buy supplies. No one would look twice at a lone woman in a faded calico dress. Her presence at the front of Madden's mercantile post would be the distraction Tahan needed to slip into the warehouse at the back. The frontier town of Prairie Dog Creek was little more than a single, wide, dusty street lined with raw lumber storefronts. It slept under a blanket of pre-dawn stillness, the air cold and thin. A few lamps still burned in the saloon, casting a sickly yellow light onto the empty boardwalk. Eliza's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She had filled a small wooden pail with water from their canteens, a pathetic substitute for the milk she was supposed to be selling. She dismounted in front of the largest and most imposing building, Madden's mercantile post, its false front looming like a gallows in the gray light. A sleepy-looking young man with thinning hair was sweeping the boardwalk with a sort of weary resignation. He looked up as she approached, his eyes barely registering her. "A bit early, are you not, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a dull monotone. "The heat is a trial," Eliza replied, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady to her ears. "I thought I would bring what little milk my cow has given before the sun sours it. I was hoping Mr. Madden might buy it for his breakfast." The clerk shrugged. "He is not here yet, but I can take it. He is always complaining about the tinned milk." As Eliza engaged the clerk in a meaningless conversation about the drought, Tahan was a shadow moving along the back alley. He found the warehouse just as he had expected, a large, barn-like structure attached to the main store. The air was thick with the smell of unseasoned pine and horse manure. He moved to the rear of the building, where a small, grimy window was set high in the wall. It was not barred, with the silent grace of a mountain cat. He found a purchase in the rough-hewn planks, pulled himself up, and slipped through the opening, landing softly on a stack of flour sacks inside. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows and shapes. Barrels of nails and pickles stood next to sacks of beans and coffee. Bolts of cloth and coils of rope hung from the rafters. And in the far corner, discreetly covered by a canvas tarp, was the source of all their misery. Tahan lifted the tarp. Crates of repeating rifles were stacked next to barrels of whiskey, their foul, sweet smell a testament to the corruption they represented. This was Madden's real business, the engine of his war. He moved from the warehouse through a connecting door into the main store. It was still dark, the air close with the smells of leather, tobacco, and oiled steel. He bypassed the main counter, heading for a small, closed door at the back that he knew must lead to an office. The door was unlocked. The office was small and cluttered. A roll-top desk dominated the space, its surface a chaotic landscape of invoices, shipping manifests, and letters. This was the nerve center of Madden's operation. Tahan began his search, his movements swift and silent. He opened drawers, his fingers sifting through papers, looking for the one thing that would prove their case, and then he found it. It was a large, leather-bound ledger, tucked away in the bottom drawer of the desk. He carried it to the front window, using the faint gray light of the approaching dawn to read the entries. His breath caught in his chest. It was all there, recorded in a neat, precise script. Crate after crate of rifles and whiskey accounted for. Payments to men with names he recognized, men known for their cruelty and greed. And then, a series of entries that made his blood run cold. Payment to J. Pike, $20, for the acquisition and branding of Hale livestock. 1 case of coal oil and matches, for pasture clearance. Bonus to men hired for military agitation. It was a confession written in ink, a detailed accounting of their entire conspiracy. He turned the page and saw a list of names under the heading Water Rights Acquisition. Eliza's name was there, along with half a dozen other small ranchers along the creeks. The bounty hunter had told the truth. This ledger was the proof, the truth written in ink and blood. He was about to close the book when one last entry at the bottom of a page caught his eye. It was a simple line, but it held the power to shatter everything. Payment to Sergeant Ames, Fort Elliott, $50, for intelligence and logistical non-interference. Sergeant Ames, the soldier he had seen drinking with Pike's man. The rot went all the way to the fort. There would be no help from the soldiers. They were on their own. A floorboard creaked out in the main store. Tahan froze, every muscle tensed. He slipped the ledger under his shirt, the cold leather a shock against his skin. He drew his knife and flattened himself against the wall beside the office door. The front door of the mercantile opened, and he heard the clerk's voice, followed by the heavy tread of 2 more men. "He is getting paranoid in his old age," one of the men grumbled, "making us check the warehouse every morning, as if a ghost is going to steal his precious whiskey." Tahan knew he had only seconds. As the men headed toward the back of the store, he slipped out of the office and darted for the front entrance. But the clerk, who was arranging tins on a shelf, saw the movement. His eyes went wide, and he opened his mouth to shout. Tahan did not hesitate. He lunged forward, not at the clerk, but at the counter beside him, vaulting over it and bursting out the front door into the brightening dawn. "Stop him!" the clerk screamed. He was in the office. Eliza, who was just concluding her transaction, saw Tahan explode from the store. The 2 men from inside came running out, drawing their pistols. Tahan grabbed her arm. "The ledger, I have it, go." Panic and adrenaline surged through Eliza. She saw a large freight wagon parked nearby, its team of 2 heavy draft horses already hitched, a delivery of some kind, left unattended. Without thinking, she ran for it, scrambling up onto the driver's bench. Tahan was right behind her, shoving her toward the middle as he leaped up and grabbed the reins. "They will catch us! The Pinto is too fast for this cart!" she cried, her voice thin with terror. No time, Tahan yelled. He snapped the reins, and the heavy wagon lurched forward with a groan of protesting wood. The men in front of the store began firing, the shots cracking through the morning air. A bullet splintered the wood of the wagon seat next to Eliza's head. Tahan urged the horses on, and they broke into a clumsy, pounding gallop down the center of the dusty street. People were appearing in doorways now, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They were gaining speed, the heavy wagon rumbling like thunder. Tahan steered it toward the edge of town, toward the rickety-looking wooden bridge that spanned a wide, dry riverbed. "The brakes!" Eliza shouted, seeing a lever by Tahan's foot. "Use the brakes!" Tahan stomped on the pedal, but his foot went straight to the floor. "They are broken," he yelled back, his face a mask of grim concentration. "The chain is snapped. Hold on." They were careening toward the bridge, the wagon completely out of control. Madden's men were on horseback now, gaining on them, their shots kicking up dust around the wagon's wheels. The bridge loomed before them, a lattice of rotting timbers and loose planks. It did not look strong enough to hold a man, let alone a runaway freight wagon. They hit the first planks with a tremendous crash. The whole structure shuddered, and a board flew into the air. The horses, their eyes wild with terror, plunged forward, driven by momentum and fear. The bridge groaned, a long, deep, tortured sound of wood surrendering to a force it could not withstand. They felt the structure begin to sag beneath them, the planks bowing and cracking under the immense weight. They made it to the other side just as a loud, final crack echoed behind them. The main supports gave way, and the entire middle section of the bridge collapsed into the riverbed in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. They were safe. Their pursuers reined in their horses at the edge of the newly formed chasm, shouting in impotent rage. The wagon finally slowed, the horses exhausted, and rolled to a stop 100 yards past the ruined bridge. Eliza and Tahan sat on the bench, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of their flight. The town, their enemies, were cut off. They had escaped, and clutched tight under Tahan's shirt was the weapon they had nearly died for Madden's book of secrets. The freight wagon, a clumsy chariot of their escape, became their refuge. They abandoned it in a thicket of mesquite a few miles from the ruined bridge and continued on Tahan's pinto, the horse's steady gait a comforting rhythm in a world thrown off its axis. They did not head back toward Eliza's ranch or Tahan's hidden camp. Tahan held the stolen ledger against his chest, a slab of cold leather that contained the poison and, hopefully, the antidote. Their destination was Mobiti, the county seat, a raw, sprawling town that served as the heart of the law in this part of the Panhandle. It was their only chance. They arrived as the sun climbed toward its zenith, turning the dust of the main street into a blinding white glare. It was market day. The square in the center of town was a chaotic swirl of life, a stark contrast to the desolate plains they had just crossed. Farmers stood by their wagons hawking vegetables. Ranchers argued over the price of cattle, and children chased each other through the throng, their shouts lost in the general din. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, fried food, and the sweat of men working under a relentless sun. Eliza slid from the horse's back, her legs unsteady. She had pulled her bonnet low to hide her face, but in this crowd, they were blessedly anonymous. They looked for a man they had only heard of, a man whose reputation was their last, desperate hope the circuit judge, Henry Miller, said to be a hard man, but a fair one. They found him holding an impromptu court on the steps of the new, unpainted courthouse, a gavel in his hand and a look of profound weariness on his face as he listened to a dispute between two neighbors over a wandering pig. Eliza knew they could not wait. They had to force the issue, to bring Madden's crimes into the full, unforgiving light of day. She took the ledger from Tahan, its weight a reassurance in her hands, and walked through the crowd, her steps determined. She stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps, waiting until the judge had finished his ruling on the pig. Judge Miller looked down at her, his brows knitting together in annoyance at the interruption. He was a man with a face like a clenched fist, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, a gesture that did not quite hide his impatience. "I must speak with you, Your Honor," Eliza said, her voice carrying over the noise of the market. "It concerns a matter of arson, theft, and a conspiracy that threatens every honest rancher in this county." A murmur went through the crowd closest to the steps. The judge's expression soured. He did not like public spectacles. "This is not the proper venue. Ma'am, you must file a complaint with the sheriff." "The sheriff is part of the problem," she replied, her voice ringing with a conviction that made several people turn to listen. "I have proof. It is all in this book." She held up the ledger. At that moment, a path cleared through the crowd, and two men strode forward. It was Madden and Pike. Madden, a portly man with a florid face and eyes as cold and small as a snake's, was smiling, a thin, unpleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. Pike, lean and dangerous, walked a step behind him, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. "Why, Judge Miller," Madden said, his voice a smooth, oily balm of false bonhomie. "It seems this poor woman is having some sort of episode. The sun can do terrible things to a person's mind. She has been making the most outlandish accusations." "He is a liar," Eliza said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "He hired men to set fire to my pasture. He tried to steal my cattle. He has a list of ranchers he plans to ruin so he can steal their water rights. The proof is right here." She opened the ledger and thrust it toward the judge. Madden's smile tightened. He changed his tactics. "The woman is clearly distraught." "Judge," he said, his tone shifting to one of pity, "and she has fallen under the influence of that man." He pointed a thick finger at Tahan, who stood silently at the edge of the crowd, his face an unreadable mask. The mood of the onlookers shifted at once. Their gazes turned on Tahan, and the air grew thick with a familiar, ugly prejudice. He was the savage, the other, the easy explanation for any trouble. "That Comanche is a known thief," Madden declared, his voice rising, playing to the crowd. "He is the one who burned her land. I have witnesses who saw him." Two grimy-looking men, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey, pushed their way forward from the crowd. "Yes, Your Honor," one of them said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Eliza's feet. "We saw him. We saw him with a torch, clear as day." The judge looked from the witnesses to Tahan, then to Eliza, his expression troubled. The law was the law, but the sentiment of the crowd was a powerful current. Tahan was Comanche. He could not testify in this court. His word meant nothing against that of two white men, no matter how disreputable they appeared. "This is a serious accusation," the judge said, his voice heavy. "Young man," he said, addressing Tahan directly, "you are accused of arson and cattle theft. I am placing you under arrest pending a formal hearing." Two deputies started to move toward Tahan. He did not flinch. He simply stood, his dignity a silent rebuke to the lies and the hatred swirling around him. Eliza's heart sank. They had failed. The truth in her hands was being suffocated by a web of prejudice and corruption. And then, a silent change occurred at the edge of the square. A group of women appeared, emerging from the shimmering heat of the plains as if from the earth itself. It was Neka, followed by a dozen other women from the Comanche camp. They were dressed in simple hide dresses, their faces impassive, their dark eyes missing nothing. They did not speak. They did not make a single threatening gesture. They simply walked to the perimeter of the crowd and stood, forming a quiet, unmoving circle. Their presence was a force, a profound and heavy moral weight that settled over the noisy square. The jeers and catcalls aimed at Tahan died in men's throats. The crowd grew uneasy under that silent, collective gaze. The women were not a threat of violence, but a testament of witness. They were the memory of the land, and their silent presence seemed to say, "We see you. We see this injustice." The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Judge Miller looked at the silent ring of women, his frown deepening. He was a man of the law, and he could feel the foundations of his courtroom, these dusty steps, beginning to shift. Eliza seized the moment. She flipped through the pages of the ledger, her finger landing on a specific entry. "This book contains a list of every man Madden has paid," she announced, her voice strong again. "It lists the money paid to these 2 false witnesses, and it lists other bribes as well." She held the book up, pointing to a line, a payment of $100 to Reverend Albright for his congregation's charity fund and his public support. A tall, stooped figure in a dusty black coat stepped forward from the crowd. It was the town's pastor, a man with a gentle, careworn face. All eyes turned to him. "Reverend Albright," the judge asked, "is this true?" The pastor looked at Madden. His expression filled not with anger, but with a deep, abiding sadness. "Mr. Madden did offer a generous donation to the church," the reverend said, his voice quiet but clear. "But it was contingent upon my preaching a sermon about the necessity of removing the native tribes for the security of our community. I refused his money." He looked at the ledger in Eliza's hand. "I have seen Mr. Madden's signature on many town documents. Your Honor, that is his handwriting." It was a small crack in Madden's wall of lies, but it was enough. The crowd began to mutter, their certainty wavering. A bribe to a man of God was something they could understand. Eliza pressed her advantage. "There is more. Judge, there is a name in this book that affects every person in this county, every soldier at the fort. There is a payment recorded to a United States Army sergeant, Sergeant Ames of Fort Elliott, for intelligence." A gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer about a single rancher and a lone Comanche. This was sedition. This was a direct attack on the authority of the United States government. The men in their wide-brimmed hats, who had been shielding their eyes from the sun and the truth, could no longer look away. Judge Miller's face was grim. He slammed his gavel down on the courthouse step, the sharp crack silencing the square. The church bell in the distance began to toll the noon hour, each ring a slow, solemn punctuation mark to the proceedings. "This hearing is suspended," the judge declared, his voice like iron. He pointed a finger at the 2 false witnesses. "You 2 are under arrest for perjury." He then looked at Madden and Pike. "You 2 will not leave this town. A full investigation will be opened into the accounts of this ledger, and I am sending a rider to Fort Elliott with a summons for Sergeant Ames. This book," he said, taking the ledger from Eliza's hands, "is now evidence in the custody of this court." He turned to Tahan. "The charges against you are not dismissed," he said, "but they are stayed. You are free to go, pending the outcome of this investigation." A collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd. Madden's face was a mask of pure fury. Pike looked as if he wanted to start shooting, but they were trapped, for the moment, by the very laws Madden had tried to twist to his own purpose. The silent circle of Comanche women turned as one and melted back into the landscape as quietly as they had arrived. Their work was done. As the crowd began to disperse, Eliza met Tahan's eyes. A small glimmer of hope, the first she had felt in days, began to warm her. They had won. They had brought the truth into the light. But as she watched Madden and Pike stalk away, their heads together in a furious, whispered conference, a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. The fight was not over. The ledger was safe with the judge, but Sergeant Ames was still at the fort. A desperate man was a dangerous one, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would not let a book of paper and ink be his ruin. He would try to get it back. He would try to silence the truth before it could speak. The temporary victory in the Mobeetie town square felt as fragile as a spider's web in a high wind. The ledger was safe for now, locked away in Judge Miller's office. But Eliza knew that paper could be burned and locks could be broken. The real danger now was Sergeant Ames. He was a cornered animal, and Tahan was certain he would not wait for the judge's summons to reach the fort. He would act, and he would act quickly. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, They sat with Tahan's pinto in a small, hidden coulee outside of town. The sounds of the market had faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the lonely sigh of the wind. "He will come tonight," Tahan said, his voice a low murmur that was nearly lost in the breeze. "He will not come alone. Pike will be with him. Their goal will be the courthouse, to get the ledger, but they will also look for us. They cannot allow us to testify." Eliza's hands, resting on her lap, clenched into fists. "So we run, we hide." Tahan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "We do not run. We choose the ground on which we fight. There is only one clear road into Mobiti from the direction of the fort, now that the bridge near the town is gone. It crosses the Prairie Dogtown fork of the Red River on an old wooden bridge 5 miles east. It is a bottleneck. That is where we will meet them." The plan was a desperate gamble, a trap made of shadow and nerve. They rode in the deep twilight, circling the town to approach the eastern bridge from the south. The structure was a dark skeleton against the star-dusted sky, groaning softly as the wind pushed against its old timbers. The riverbed below was a wide, pale ribbon of sand and rock, almost completely dry. They would not wait on the bridge, but below it, using the darkness of the riverbed as their cover. They worked in a swift, silent partnership. Tahan had come prepared, taking a coil of thick rope and a small, sharp axe from his saddle gear. While he moved to the far side of the bridge, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden planks, Eliza gathered a handful of small, flat stones. He showed her a spot beneath the bridge where a thick pillar cast a pool of absolute blackness. "Stay here," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear for a fleeting second. "When the time is right, make the sound of a nervous horse, not too loud, just enough to make them look the wrong way." He pressed a small string of brass bells, the kind used to track horses in deep woods, into her hand before melting back into the shadows. Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs. She was terrified, but a strange, cold calm had settled over her. This was the final crucible. Everything had led to this night, to this bridge that spanned the chasm between two worlds, the world of law and the world of violence. She waited. The wind was a constant, mournful voice, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each minute an hour, each gust of wind the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She thought of her quiet farm, of the simple, hard life she had known. It seemed a lifetime away. The woman who had been afraid of a single rider in the dark was now crouched under a bridge, waiting to ambush a corrupt soldier and a hired killer. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic drumming that was not the wind. Hoofbeats, 2 horses, moving at a steady, cautious pace. She peered through a gap in the bridge pilings and saw 2 silhouettes approaching. They slowed as they reached the entrance to the bridge, their figures stark against the night sky. From the darkness on the far bank, Tahan moved. He was a deeper shadow among shadows. He had stretched the rope low across the entrance, tied to the railings, a nearly invisible tripwire. The first horse, carrying the lean figure she recognized as Pike, stepped onto the bridge. Its forelegs hit the rope, and it went down with a terrified scream, throwing its rider hard onto the planks. The second horse, ridden by Sergeant Ames, reared violently, its whinny a sharp cry of panic. Now, Eliza shook the small brass bells, the sound a frantic, unnatural jingle that seemed to come from downstream, away from the bridge. Pike, scrambling to his feet, cursed and fired his pistol into the darkness where the sound had come from. The muzzle flash was a brief, angry blossom of orange light, and the report of the gun echoed flatly in the riverbed. That was the only distraction Tahan needed, while Pike was looking the wrong way. Tahan vaulted over the railing and onto the bridge. He was not a gunslinger. He was a warrior, and he was closing the distance. Eliza saw his form move with a terrifying speed. Pike turned, firing again, but Tahan was already on him. There was a brief, brutal flurry of motion, the dull thud of bodies colliding, the glint of steel in the starlight. Pike's pistol clattered across the wooden planks. Sergeant Ames, meanwhile, was fighting to control his terrified mount. Eliza stood up from her hiding place and threw a lit torch, one she had prepared earlier, up onto the bridge. It landed near the struggling horses, its flickering light casting wild, dancing shadows. The panicked animals, their eyes rolling in the firelight, broke free. Ames was thrown from his saddle, and both horses bolted, galloping madly back the way they had come. The scene on the bridge was a tableau of chaos. Pike and Tahan were locked in a desperate struggle. Ames was crawling away from the fight, his face a pale mask of terror. As Tahan fought, he maneuvered Pike toward one of the main support pillars of the bridge. During the fight, a stray bullet from Pike's wild shots had slammed into the thick wooden beam, weakening it. The violent struggling of the fallen horse had done the rest. With a sudden, powerful shove, Tahan slammed Pike against the damaged pillar. There was a terrible, groaning crack of tortured timber. The section of the bridge beneath Pike's feet gave way. He cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the riverbed below as a whole section of the bridge collapsed with a deafening roar of splintering wood. Ames screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He scrambled to his feet and tried to run, but Tahan was on him in 2 strides, his knife at the sergeant's throat. Eliza ran onto what was left of the bridge. A searing pain shot through her left arm, and she looked down to see a long, bloody tear in her sleeve, a splinter from the collapsing bridge, or a graze from one of Pike's bullets. She did not know which. The adrenaline was afire in her veins, and she barely felt it. Tahan stood over the trembling sergeant, the fury in his eyes as hot as the torchlight. He could end it right there. He could have the vengeance his people deserved. The blood price for every lie, every broken treaty, every acre of stolen land. Eliza saw the struggle in him, the battle between the warrior's rage and the man's honor, and then she saw him make his choice. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the knife. A dead man cannot tell the truth, Tahan said, his voice a low, hard growl. But you will. You will stand before the judge and tell him everything. Ames was sobbing now, incoherent with fear. Yes, he gasped. Anything. I will tell them anything. They took the sergeant, a broken, defeated man, and retreated from the ruined bridge. They found a sheltered hollow a mile away, out of the wind, and Tahan built a small, smokeless fire from dry mesquite roots. The night had grown cold, and the wind felt sharper now that the fighting was over. Tahan gently took Eliza's arm, his touch surprisingly tender. He tore a strip from his own shirt and carefully cleaned the long, shallow gash. Their faces were close in the firelight, their shared ordeal a palpable thing that hung in the air between them. The world had been reduced to this small circle of warmth, to the quiet hiss of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. You were brave tonight, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. So were you, she whispered. When you had him, I saw you choose. You chose justice, not revenge. He finished tying the bandage, and his hand lingered on her arm. After a moment, he found her other hand and held it, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm and strong, a solid, reassuring presence in the vast, cold darkness. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, unthinking gesture of exhaustion and trust. They sat like that for a long time, watching the coals of the fire glow. 2 survivors huddled together against the night. I promise you, Tahan said into the silence, we will see this through. We will protect the truth, and I will protect you. I know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I you. They had built their own bridge tonight, not of wood and nails, but of courage and shared conviction. It was a fragile structure, perhaps, but it felt stronger and more real than anything she had ever known. Ames, who had been huddled on the other side of the fire, seemed to pull himself together. He looked at them, his eyes wide with a desperate, calculating fear. He knew his word alone might not be enough to save him from a hangman's noose. "I can prove it," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "I can prove everything I say. Madden, he is a fool. He writes everything down. There are letters. He sent me letters, handwritten, with my orders. I kept them. I kept them as insurance. They are hidden at the fort. I can give them to the judge." The ride back to Mobiti was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Dawn broke pale and watery, illuminating a world that seemed exhausted after the night's violence. Sergeant Ames rode between them, a slumped figure of defeat, his hands bound with a strip of leather. The bravado and cruelty had been stripped from him, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling core of self-preservation. He was their proof, their unwilling key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. They did not ride into the town square. Instead, Tahan guided the Pinto through the back alleys, his knowledge of the town's hidden pathways as sure as his knowledge of the open plains. He stopped behind a small, respectable-looking house with a neatly tended garden, the home of Judge Henry Miller. Tahan waited with Ames in the alley while Eliza, her arm throbbing with a dull ache, walked to the front door, the heavy ledger clutched in her good hand. The judge answered the door himself, a cup of coffee in his hand, his face etched with the lines of a sleepless night. His expression hardened when he saw her, expecting another round of public drama. Before he could speak, Eliza cut him off, her voice low and urgent. "Your Honor, we have him, Sergeant Ames. He is alive, and he is ready to confess to everything." The judge's watery blue eyes widened. He looked past her, down the street, as if expecting an ambush. "He is with the Comanche scout." "Tahan," Eliza continued, "they are waiting in the alley. The sergeant has also told us of letters, handwritten by Madden, that will corroborate his testimony. Judge Miller was a man who had built his life on the foundation of law and order. The events of the previous day had shaken that foundation, revealing a rot that went deeper than he had imagined. He was a man of procedure, but he was also a man of sense. He knew this was a moment that called for something more than protocol. He set his coffee cup down and followed her without another word. The confession happened not on the public steps, but in the quiet, book-lined study of the judge's home. Ames, his face the color of ash, stammered out the whole sordid story. He told them of Madden's plan from the beginning, of the money he had received to look the other way, to feed Madden information about patrol schedules, to spread rumors among the soldiers. He spoke of the deliberate plot to instigate a war, a plot that would have cost countless lives on both sides, all for the sake of profit. When he was done, a heavy, disgusted silence filled the room. The judge dispatched a deputy to the fort with Ames to retrieve the promised letters, with strict instructions that the sergeant was to be brought back immediately. Then, he looked at Eliza and Tahan, a new, hard-won respect in his eyes. "What Madden has done is not just a crime against you," he said, his voice grim. "It is a crime against this entire territory. It is a form of treason, and it will be answered for publicly." The town square was already beginning to fill with people, drawn by a current of rumor and unease that had been circulating since dawn. The news of the destroyed bridge had traveled fast, and the sight of a deputy riding out toward the fort had only fanned the flames of speculation. When Judge Miller appeared on the courthouse steps, with Eliza and Tahan standing a respectful distance behind him, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. The proceedings were swift and decisive. The judge laid out the bare facts of the conspiracy, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. Then, Sergeant Ames, flanked by two deputies, was brought forward. In a quavering voice, he repeated his confession for all to hear, his words a death knell for Madden's schemes. He told them of the fire, the false witnesses, the plan to provoke a war. He spoke the truth, not out of courage, but out of a desperate, cowardly desire to save his own skin. As he spoke, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. It was Madden and Pike. They had been trying to slip away, to get to their horses and flee before the net closed completely. But the people of the town, the very ranchers and merchants Madden had sought to manipulate and ruin, formed a human wall, their faces hard and unforgiving. The deputies moved in, and for the first time, Madden's bluster failed him. He saw the cold, hard reality of his situation in the eyes of his neighbors, and he surrendered without a fight. With the conspirators in custody, Judge Miller held up his hand for silence. He held the ledger in one hand and the packet of Ames's retrieved letters in the other. These documents will be the foundation of a federal investigation that will reach far beyond the borders of this county, he announced, his gaze sweeping the crowd. The letters confirm that Madden was part of a larger syndicate, with ties to land speculators in New Mexico. But our justice begins here, today. He set the evidence aside. By the authority vested in me by the state of Texas, I am signing a temporary injunction to be made permanent by the next circuit court. The traditional water sources, including the springs and creeks on federal and unclaimed lands, will be recognized as a common resource. Access for the purpose of watering livestock and personal use cannot be denied to any resident of this county, be they settler or Comanche. The era of using fences and fear to monopolize the lifeblood of this land is over. As he spoke the final words, a change came over the air. A cool breeze, the first in months, swept through the dusty square, carrying with it a scent Eliza had almost forgotten the smell of rain. A single, fat drop of water landed on her hand, then another on her cheek. Slowly at first, then with a growing, steady rhythm, the rain began to fall. It was a soft, cleansing rain, not a violent storm. It pattered on the tin roofs and turned the white dust of the square to a dark, rich brown. A collective sigh went through the crowd as people turned their faces up to the sky, letting the cool water wash away the dust and the tension. The long, brutal drought was breaking. The land and the people could breathe again. The sound of the rain was a gentle, insistent drumming that seemed to wash the hatred and suspicion from the air. In the quiet that followed the judge's decree, Eliza and Tahan slipped away from the crowd, their part in the public drama finished. They walked in a comfortable silence, the rain soaking their hair and clothes, but neither of them minded. They found themselves standing under the wooden awning of the livery stable, watching the water run in small rivulets down the packed earth of the street. The world smelled clean and new. The warm, rich scent of wet earth rose up to meet them, a perfume of forgiveness and rebirth. Eliza looked at Tahan. His face was streaked with rain, and in his dark eyes, she saw not the guarded scout or the fierce warrior, but the quiet, honorable man who had stood by her, who had chosen justice over vengeance, an unsteadiness that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with him bloomed in her chest. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face. It was a smile of shared victory, of profound relief, and of something more, something deeper that needed no words. She found herself smiling back, a shy, hesitant curve of her lips that quickly blossomed into a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The trust that had been forged in fire and fear had, in the cleansing peace of the rain, finally revealed itself as love. He reached out and gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek, his touch sending a shiver through her that was warmer than the summer sun. She leaned into his touch, a silent, implicit permission. He moved closer, and then his arms were around her, pulling her into a gentle, secure embrace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart under the damp cotton of his shirt, a rhythm that felt as right and as natural as the falling rain. It was an embrace of equals, of partners, of two survivors who had found in each other a sanctuary from the storm. After a long moment, he led her to the small room she had rented at the boarding house. At the door, he paused, His hand resting on the latch, he looked at her, his eyes asking a question that his lips did not form. She answered by reaching up and gently touching his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She opened the door and led him inside, closing it softly behind them, leaving the rain and the reconciled world to themselves. The rains that followed the trial were not a flood, but a long, slow, and steady blessing. For weeks, the skies remained a soft, pearly gray, and the water seeped deep into the parched earth, awakening life that had been sleeping for what seemed like an eternity. The Llano Estacado, the stark and barren plain, began to blush with a faint, miraculous green. The black scar on Eliza's pasture was the first to heal, covered over with the tender shoots of new grass. The creek, which had been a dry, sandy wound, now ran with a quiet, steady current, its voice a constant, soothing murmur. The resolution in the town square was not a magic spell that erased all prejudice, but it was a beginning. Judge Miller's injunction on the water rights held, and a new, fragile peace settled over the territory. The investigation into the New Mexico land syndicate cast a long shadow, and men who had once been loud with their hatreds now spoke in more measured tones. The law, for once, had served the cause of justice, and this had a profound and calming effect on the land and its people. In the wake of the storm, Eliza and Tahan began the slow, quiet work of rebuilding. It was a work they did together. They returned to her small cabin not as two separate people from two different worlds, but as partners who had forged their bond in the heart of a fire. The cabin itself began to change. Tahan, with his deep knowledge of the land, showed her how to build a small diversion ditch from the creek to her cornfield, a system of irrigation that was far more efficient than her back-breaking work with the buckets. He repaired her corral fence, not with sagging wire, but with sturdy posts of juniper wood, their joints so cleverly notched that they needed no nails. Eliza, in turn, shared the knowledge of her world. She showed him the careful science of crop rotation, explaining how planting beans one year would enrich the soil for the corn the next. She taught him the rhythms of her milk cows, the quiet patience required to turn their milk into butter and cheese, a way of preserving abundance for the lean times. He learned to appreciate the steady, methodical labor of the farm, a different kind of discipline from the hunter's watchfulness, but a discipline nonetheless. One day, Tahan took her back to his people's hidden camp in the canyon. This time, she was not a frightened trespasser, but an honored guest. She walked into the camp not with a rifle in her hand, but with her arms full of fresh baked bread and hard yellow cheese, gifts from her own hearth. She was met not with suspicion, but with quiet, dignified curiosity. She spent the day with Nika and the other women, her hands busy as she learned. Nika gave her a small pouch of corn kernels, unlike any she had ever seen. They were of different colors, some blue, some red, some a speckled white. "This is the corn of our grandmothers," Nika explained, her hands showing Eliza how to feel the weight and health of each seed. "It does not grow as tall or as fat as the white man's corn. Its roots, however, go deeper. It knows how to find water when the surface is dry. It knows how to survive. It is a patient corn." Eliza spent the afternoon learning the songs the women sang as they ground the corn, the rhythms of their work a form of prayer. She learned that a community was not just a collection of people, but a fabric woven from shared stories, shared labor, and shared food. Tahan, meanwhile, spent his time with the men of her world. He rode with a neighboring rancher, a man whose property had also been on Madden's list, and learned the art of building strong fences, of stretching wire taut and true. He saw that a fence was not just a barrier, but a tool for managing the land, for letting a pasture rest and recover. He learned how to cut and cure the tall prairie grass, stacking it into tight, sweet-smelling ricks of hay that would feed the cattle through the harsh, lean months of winter. It was a strategy of foresight, a way of making a promise to the future. The exchange was a quiet revolution. It was not a blending of two cultures into one, but a respectful borrowing, a sharing of wisdom that strengthened them both. They were building a new way of life, one seed, one fence post at a time. As the season turned toward autumn, and the cottonwoods in the canyon began to burnish a brilliant gold, Nneka announced that there would be a ceremony. It was not a great tribal gathering, but a small, intimate affair around the central fire of the camp. They had come to honor the woman who had helped save their access to the water, the woman who had spoken the truth in the white man's court. Eliza stood before the fire, dressed in a simple doe-skin dress one of the women had given her. The soft leather felt strange and wonderful against her skin. Nneka stood before her, a sprig of smoking sage in her hand, its sharp, clean scent purifying the air. She spoke in her own language, her voice a resonant chant that told the story of the drought, the fire, the deception, and the final, cleansing rain. She told of the woman who had come from the other world, who had been an enemy, but who had proven to have an honorable heart. Then, Nneka looked directly at Eliza, her ancient eyes bright with affection and respect. She gave her a new name, a name in the tongue of the Nemanu. The name was Papi Kia, which she then translated for Eliza. It meant keeper of the source. It was a name that honored her not for what she had done, but for what she was, a guardian of the life-giving water, a protector of the truth from which all justice flows. It was the greatest honor of Eliza's life, a gift that settled into her soul and healed the last of her lonely, broken places. They did not stay in the canyon, nor did they remain solely at Eliza's cabin. They chose a piece of land on the far edge of her property, a place where the rolling prairie met the first gentle slopes of the Caprock country. It was a place that belonged to both worlds. There, with the help of Tahan's people and Eliza's rancher neighbors, they built a new home. It was not a log cabin, nor was it a hide teepee. It was something new, a sturdy house of adobe brick, made from the very earth they stood upon, with a wide, welcoming porch and a roof of stout cottonwood beams. Their home became a bridge. It was a place where a Comanche warrior could sit down to share coffee with a white rancher, where a settler's wife could learn the art of willow basketry from a Comanche elder. It was a place where differences were not a cause for fear, but a reason for curiosity and respect. It was a testament to their belief that a future could be built, not by erasing the lines that divided people, but by creating a space where those lines could be crossed with open hands and open hearts. One cool, clear evening, they stood on their porch and looked out at their shared world. The pastures were a deep, rich green, dotted with Eliza's fat, contented milk cows. In the distance, they could see the vast, unfenced lands where Tahan's people grazed their horse herds. The creek, full and clear, flowed between the two, a silver thread stitching their lives together. The sky was a vast, inverted bowl of impossible blue, and the horizon was a clean, sharp line that promised endless possibility. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and, with courage, honor, and love, they had built something whole, something that would last. They had planted the seeds of a new world, and before them, the future stretched out as wide and as hopeful as the Texas horizon. Thank you for listening to the story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.